Beneath the roots of America's forgotten forests, there are secrets that were never meant to surface. Secrets clawing against coffin lids, whispering through the soil, and bleeding into history like poison. One of them begins here in Ravenwood, New York. Imagine this: 143 bodies, unearthed beneath the floorboards of a church. Every skeleton fractured, every bone marked with symbols carved by human hands. Not the wounds of war, not the remains of plague, but ritual. Orchestrated suffering, inflicted deliberately, with precision and with faith. These weren't random killings. They were ceremonies, and at the heart of them, three brothers whose names were whispered in fear even decades later: Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft. Men who carried the mask of holiness but wielded it like a blade. They told their followers that pain was sacred, that agony itself was the doorway to God, and people believed them. They believed so deeply that they gave up their homes, their bodies, and eventually their lives, all to walk into the abyss these brothers had prepared. You see, history isn't just a story written in books. It's a labyrinth designed to keep you out of the rooms you were never supposed to enter. But tonight, you will. The story of the Ravencroft family isn't just about one cult in a backwoods church. It's about how power operates when dressed in faith, how control is built not with chains, but with ideas that sink deeper than steel. And once you see it, you'll never unsee it. But before we descend any further, I want you to do something. Right now, in the comments, tell me where you're watching this from, your city, your state. Because when you speak it, you're placing yourself in this story, anchoring your place in history. And trust me, you'll want to be anchored before we start pulling back the floorboards of Ravenwood. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because what I'm about to reveal has been buried, sealed, and denied for more than 160 years. This is dangerous knowledge, knowledge that alters you once you hear it. And make no mistake, once we begin, there's no turning back. So take a breath, steady your mind, and step with me into the shadows. Ravenwood, New York, on the surface just another farming settlement in the 1820s. Rolling hills, wooden barns, smoke curling from chimneys in the dead of winter. A place so ordinary, you'd think nothing extraordinary could ever happen there. But history is cruel. It hides its most venomous truths behind the mask of the ordinary. The Second Great Awakening was sweeping through the region then. A wildfire of revival meetings, preachers calling down visions, people collapsing in fields as if touched by God himself. To outsiders, it looked like religious passion. But in Ravenwood, it became something else entirely. That was when the Ravencroft brothers arrived. Elder Ezra. His presence alone could silence a room. His voice, measured, deliberate, sharp as a knife, cut straight into the soul of anyone who dared to look into his black eyes. Deacon Silas the scribe, a scholar of shadows, hiding behind his ink-stained spectacles, writing scripture that no one else could question. And then, Prophet Caleb, the youngest, but the most disturbing, a man whose whispers could fill a room, whose pale eyes rolled back into visions that left people trembling in fear and awe. These three weren't just preachers. They were architects of obedience. They purchased land, raised a church of dark stone, and called it the Church of the Pure Spirit. Not the simple wooden chapels people were used to, but a structure heavy with intention. Octagonal in shape, windowless, lantern-lit. It was built not to let light in, but to trap it. At first, their message seemed harmless, almost inspiring. Salvation through suffering, purity through pain. They spoke of fire refining gold, of Christ's agony on the cross, of the flesh as the prison of the soul. But unlike the others preaching in that age, they weren't speaking metaphorically. They meant it literally. To be saved, you must be broken. To be holy, you must bleed. And the timing was perfect. America was restless, fractured, searching. The Ravencrofts knew it. They offered certainty in an uncertain time. They promised meaning to the desperate, redemption to the guilty, and secret spiritual power to the wealthy who thought themselves above ordinary faith. And people came, one by one. They gathered inside that stone church. At first fasting, then night vigils, then ice, cold immersions that numbed the body and stripped the will. Slowly, carefully, the Ravencrofts conditioned their flock to accept more, to surrender more, to suffer more. Like frogs in slowly boiling water, the congregation didn't notice they were already being cooked alive. They thought they had found God. What they had really found was the beginning of hell. By 1827, the Ravencroft Church had grown beyond a curiosity. Nearly 100 souls now circled the brothers, caught in their orbit, bound by promises of purification. Some gave their savings, others gave their land, the most devoted gave their bodies, and still, more kept coming. You see, the Ravencrofts had a gift. They knew exactly who to pull in. The broken, the desperate, the lonely, a widow like Margaret Wilkins, who had buried her husband and 2 children in the span of one winter, she wrote later in her journal, before it was seized by federal investigators, how Elder Ezra told her that her grief was not meaningless, that it was sacred, that her agony had a purpose. In that moment, she believed him. She gave herself fully to their cause. This is how psychological control works, not with chains, not with prisons, but by taking pain, your pain, and reshaping it into a weapon they can wield against you. To the Ravencrofts, despair wasn't something to heal. It was raw material. They molded it into faith. They turned sorrow into devotion. They taught that suffering itself was the ladder to heaven. By then, they had begun selecting the most obedient followers for what they called special purification. Fasting for days until bones showed through skin, ice, water baptisms that left the lips blue and the body trembling on the edge of death. All framed as rituals of cleansing, all justified by scripture twisted into something unrecognizable. And the congregation applauded it. Because when you're told again and again that pain is holy, that it purges sin, you stop questioning. You begin to crave it. That's how the trap is set. The Ravencrofts escalated carefully, methodically. They were patient shepherds, leading their flock step by step. And then, in 1829, they crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Beneath the stone floor of the church, workers loyal to the brothers had begun digging. At first, it seemed like mere storage cellars. But the deeper the chambers stretched, the darker their purpose became. Isolation cells, ritual chambers, places where screams could not be heard from above. By the time the tunnels were finished, the stage was set for what the Ravencrofts would call ascension. But make no mistake, this was no path to heaven. It was the blueprint of murder, dressed as salvation. December 21st, 1829, the longest night of the year. In Ravenwood, the congregation was summoned. Nearly 150 followers filled the windowless stone sanctuary, their breath rising in cold clouds, their eyes fixed on the Ravencroft brothers. 12 candles burned in the shape of a spiral carved into the floorboards, leading toward a central platform. Every detail of that night was designed to do one thing: strip away doubt and replace it with submission. Elder Ezra spoke first, his voice rising with each word. He declared that their rituals up to now had only been preparation, that the true cleansing was about to begin. He told them the Spirit itself had grown impatient, that tonight, some of them would ascend. The words hit the congregation like a spark to dry timber. Then Prophet Caleb emerged. Witnesses would later describe his appearance as inhuman. His skin pale as ash, his body moving in unnatural jerks, his eyes rolled back until only whites showed. He began speaking in a language no one recognized. Guttural sounds, shrieks, whispers that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. Some fainted, others fell to their knees in awe. When Caleb finally collapsed and rose again, he spoke in a steady voice. The Spirit had chosen 3 members for the honor of first ascension. Their names were called Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, Rebecca Winters. Each was led to the platform and bound to inverted wooden crosses. Ezra explained this was not blasphemy, it was reversal. The path from pride to humility, from life into death, from death into rebirth. The congregation was ordered to watch. Then came the 7 trials. First, suffocation by water, soaked cloths pressed to their faces, drowning without drowning. Then burial in soil, packed around them until only their heads remained above the earth. Fire followed, heated irons pressed to their flesh in precise patterns. Then freezing immersion in ice water, again and again, until consciousness flickered like a candle flame. Hartford, the blacksmith who later escaped, vomited as he watched. But most did not flee. Conditioned by years of slow indoctrination, they chanted through every scream, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." By dawn, the 3 victims were broken, barely breathing. Caleb pressed his hands upon their heads, their bodies convulsed, bones snapping, eyes bursting wide as they spoke in that same unholy language. Moments later, they were dead. The Ravencrofts declared them ascended. Their corpses were not buried. They were preserved, displayed, worshipped. And for the congregation, this was not horror, it was proof. The morning after the first ascension, Ravenwood changed forever. A handful of shaken members fled that very night, vanishing into the woods, never to return, but the majority remained. And those who stayed did not recoil in horror. They leaned in closer. What had begun as ritual was now confirmed as revelation. Elder Ezra declared that Sarah, Michael, and Rebecca had bypassed judgment entirely, that their souls were purified beyond sin, received directly into heaven. Their bodies, he said, were now holy vessels, relics to be revered. And so the corpses were not buried. They were carried into the underground chambers, laid on stone slabs, dressed in white linen. Congregants were invited to pray over them, to touch them, to ask for strength to endure their own coming trials. Think about this for a moment. For most faiths, death is an ending. For the Ravencrofts, it became a sacrament, a climax, a doorway that proved their teachings true. And once that doorway was opened, there was no going back. This is how institutional control mutates. It escalates. The impossible becomes acceptable, and the acceptable becomes holy. What should have shattered the congregation into revolt only bound them tighter. Why? Because fear mixed with awe is the strongest glue of all. Over the next months, the Ravencrofts expanded their doctrine. Elevation, what outsiders would later call murder, was now central to their theology, and the underground chambers beneath the church grew more elaborate. The chamber of preparation, where chosen vessels were isolated in darkness for days, the chamber of trials, where the tortures were carried out, and the chamber of saints, where the dead were preserved in grotesque tableaux, posed in prayer, displayed like trophies of faith. One survivor later told investigators, the smell wasn't of rot, but of chemicals, turpentine spirits, and something sickly sweet. They told us it was the perfume of sanctity. I know now it was embalming fluid. But here is the most disturbing truth: the Ravencrofts didn't need to force obedience. Their followers offered themselves. They believed that the more they suffered, the closer they came to God. They watched people die and begged for their turn. And this is where we must pause. Because what began in Ravenwood was not isolated. This is the pattern of all hidden power systems. Religious, political, even corporate. They start with belief, then demand obedience, then sanctify suffering. And when suffering becomes sacred, you will die willingly for your master. The Ravencrofts had found the formula, and they would refine it for decades. From 1830 onward, the Church of the Pure Spirit presented two faces. To the outside world, it was a beacon of piety, a place of charity, song, and supposed renewal. The Ravencrofts hosted gatherings, donated to orphanages, even welcomed traveling preachers into their sanctuary. To visiting eyes, they looked like devout leaders helping a small community flourish. Respectable, harmless, almost noble, but beneath the stone floor in the labyrinth no outsider ever saw. Their real work continued. The rituals grew more frequent. In the early years, perhaps only a few deaths a year. By the mid-1830s, the pace accelerated. Quarterly ceremonies. By 1840, monthly ascensions. Solstices and equinoxes became high holy days drenched in screams and blood. And yet, they kept their followers loyal. They perfected the art of gradual escalation. Every cruelty was wrapped in scripture. Every torment was framed as a divine necessity. To hesitate was weakness. To resist was rebellion against God himself. And the victims, widows, orphans, drifters, the forgotten, were carefully chosen so that their disappearance raised no alarms beyond Ravenwood. But here's what made the Ravencrofts uniquely dangerous: they did not kill in secret shame. They celebrated it openly within their walls. They preserved the dead like saints. They turned the chamber of saints into a gallery of devotion. Rows of bodies embalmed, skeletons arranged in lifelike poses, arms lifted in prayer, jaws locked in expressions of ecstasy. Followers would enter that chamber weeping with joy, convinced they were in the presence of holiness. One escapee later confessed, "When I first saw the chamber of saints, I thought I was in heaven itself. The bodies seemed radiant. I wept because I wanted to be like them." It took years before I understood I had been weeping over corpses. This is the depth of control. They didn't just force obedience. They engineered desire. They inverted the human instinct for survival, convincing people to crave their own destruction. And outside Ravenwood, nothing. Silence. No scandal reached Albany. No preacher cried fall, because power, whether religious or political, knows how to shield itself. The Ravencrofts wore the mask of piety in public, while beneath, they constructed a kingdom of bones. And it worked. For 30 years, it worked. The question is not how they hid it. The question is why no one wanted to see. What made Ravenwood so enduring was not just fear. Fear alone breaks quickly. It burns bright, then collapses into rebellion or despair. What the Ravencrofts perfected was subtler, more insidious, the rewiring of human instinct. They discovered that if you take suffering, pain, hunger, humiliation, and pair it with reward, you can change how the brain interprets it. This is what modern psychologists call trauma bonding. Imagine being deprived of food for days, your body shaking with weakness. Then, at the breaking point, you're given a scrap of bread, while Ezra whispers, "The Spirit has fed you." The relief is overwhelming. The association fuses. You begin to crave the suffering, because only through it do you experience that sharp, holy release. The same with punishment. A follower whipped for doubting doctrine would later be embraced by Caleb, told that their tears had watered the soil of salvation. The lash became a doorway. Pain became sacred. Guilt became cleansing. Doubt became proof of faith. Step by step, the congregation's instincts were inverted. What once triggered terror began to trigger devotion. What should have sparked rebellion sparked surrender, and soon, the followers were not merely obeying, they were competing to prove who could suffer most. This is the genius of psychological captivity. When the prison bars are inside your skull, no walls are needed. And here lies the deeper terror. The Ravencrofts were not inventing something new. They were exploiting something ancient in human nature. The hunger to belong, the need to believe suffering has meaning. History is filled with empires, religions, and movements that boot loyalty on the same principle. From gladiatorial arenas to holy wars to modern cults, pain, sacrifice, and obedience braided into the same rope, but Ravenwood refined it into ritual theater. Each ascension was staged not just as a killing, but as a drama of purification. The congregation was forced to watch, to weep, to chant, to participate. This is how the horror spread, through performance. And when every voice repeats the lie feels true. One witness who later broke free put it simply, "They stole my ability to feel horror. I watched a woman die, and all I felt was envy." This is indoctrination at its darkest. Not chains, not guns, but the quiet reprogramming of human instinct until love and death, pain and worship become the same thing. And once that threshold is crossed, obedience is eternal. If the first generation of followers came to Ravenwood by choice, or at least by persuasion, the next generation never had that luxury. They were born into it, children of the faithful, raised beneath the black rafters of the church. Their lullabies were chants, their bedtime stories sermons of blood. They never saw a world beyond the hills. For them, Ravenwood wasn't a prison. It was the universe, and the Ravencrofts understood the power of shaping belief from the cradle. Infants were baptized not with water, but with ash taken from burned relics. Toddlers were taught games that mimicked ritual, pretending to send dolls, drawing chalk circles on the dirt. By age 7, they could recite Ezra's sermons word for word. By age 12, they were taken to witness their first elevation. Imagine that. Your first memory of adolescence is not a birthday, not a school lesson, but the sight of a neighbor, or even a parent strapped to stone, blood running in rivulets as the congregation sings. To the outside world, that's trauma. To the Ravencrofts, it was education, and the effect was devastating. When you grow up in darkness, you do not call it dark, you call it home. One survivor, taken as a child, later confessed, "I didn't know death was wrong. I thought it was love. When my mother volunteered to ascend, I felt proud, like she had won a prize. For years, I prayed it would be my turn." This is the weapon of generational indoctrination. Adults can doubt. Adults can remember a world before the cage. But children, they have no before. Their reality is sculpted entirely by those who control their earliest years. And in Ravenwood, that meant generations were forged into obedience like iron into chains. By the 1850s, the cult was not dwindling, it was thriving. Children became its new bloodline. By 16, Many were married within the congregation, binding families tighter. By 20, they were candidates for ascension. Every new birth was celebrated as another soldier of faith, and the chambers beneath the church grew more crowded. Saints posed in endless rows, while their children prayed beside them, longing to take their place. The Ravencrofts had achieved what every empire, every tyrant, every cult leader dreams of: permanence, because when you control the children, you control the future. And in Ravenwood, the future belonged to death. By the late 1850s, the quiet hills of Ravenwood were no longer as silent as the Ravencrofts wished. Travelers passing through reported strange sights. Processions at night, firelight flickering against the windows of the chapel long after midnight. Some swore they heard singing drifting across the woods, not hymns of joy, but low, droning chants that carried an otherworldly cadence. Others whispered of graveyards that seemed too crowded for such a small village, of livestock vanishing, of entire families moving away, without ever being seen again. Merchants avoided the town. It was said that if you slept in Ravenwood as a stranger, you would not wake up. Caravans took longer routes to steer clear of its roads. Rumors reached Albany, and even New York City, that in the Catskills there was a church where people disappeared. A church where the sermons never ended. A church that was less a sanctuary than a mouth swallowing lives. But suspicion is not the same as proof, and the Ravencrofts were masters at controlling what the outside world could see. When curious clergymen visited, they were greeted with bread, prayer, and smiles. The children were well dressed, rehearsed in their piety. The church looked humble but orderly. Nothing seemed amiss, and then there was the problem of power. The Ravencrofts had wealth, land, trade ties, and influence with officials who preferred donations to inconvenient questions. To accuse them outright was dangerous. Careers could end, reputations could be ruined, so most whispered but none acted. Still, the cracks widened. A farmhand escaped one winter night, stumbling barefoot into a neighboring town. His tale was incoherent, raving of blood rites, skeletons on display, and children chanting over corpses. Locals dismissed him as mad, yet others began to wonder why was it always the poorest, the forgotten, the wanderers who vanished near Ravenwood. And what of the railway workers who refused to build tracks near the valley? They said the land felt wrong, that every time they dug into the soil, they unearthed bones that crumbled at the touch. The Ravencrofts tightened their hold, but for the first time the outside world was looking in, not closely enough, not with enough courage. But the whispers had begun. And in history, whispers have a way of becoming screams. The first true attempt to pierce Ravenwood's veil came in the autumn of 1861. War was raging across America, yet in the quiet valleys of New York, another kind of battle was about to unfold. It began when two schoolteachers from Albany, Mary Wilcox and her brother Thomas, decided to investigate the disappearances. They had heard too many rumors, families gone without trace, travelers never arriving at their destinations. Mary, a reformist and abolitionist, believed evil flourished in silence. She wrote in her diary, "If no one else will look, then I must." The siblings arrived in Ravenwood under the guise of missionaries. They carried Bibles, pamphlets, and a polite smile, expecting poverty, ignorance, perhaps some eccentric superstition. What they found instead was order. Too much order. The townsfolk spoke in unison, greeted with the same phrases, carried the same hollow reverence in their eyes. Children stared without blinking. Adults never laughed. Every home bore a symbol etched above its door: the raven, wings outstretched. The Ravencrofts welcomed them warmly. Caleb, the younger brother, offered them lodging and food. Ezra delivered sermons that dripped with honeyed words. Yet Mary noticed how no one ate until Ezra raised his hand. How no one spoke unless Caleb gave permission. How every eye darted nervously toward the church, as if it were not merely a building but a watchtower. On their third night, Mary heard something. A low wailing beneath the chapel floorboards. At first she thought it was the wind. But then came the rhythm. Chanting, dozens of voices, the thud of drums. She pressed her ear to the floor of their room. The sound was coming from below. They tried to leave at dawn, but Ezra was already waiting. He asked why they seemed in such haste. Mary lied, saying they were continuing their mission further north. Ezra smiled. "But the Spirit has chosen you to stay. Few outsiders are ever so blessed." That night, Thomas vanished, Mary searched the entire village, frantic, begging for answers. The townsfolk only repeated the same phrase, "He has ascended." Mary fled into the forest barefoot, clutching her diary. 3 days later, a farmer in Kingston found her half delirious, covered in scratches, raving about bones beneath the church and a brother who was eaten by prayer. Her testimony reached authorities. But the war consumed the nation's attention. A single missing schoolteacher was nothing compared to battlefields soaked in blood. The report was shelved. Ravenwood went untouched. But the silence had broken. Someone had seen the truth. The Civil War raged like wildfire across the United States, but in the hidden folds of the Catskills, Ravenwood thrived in the chaos. Soldiers marched. Cities burned. Newspapers brimmed with casualty lists so long that one more disappearance in a quiet valley barely drew a sigh. The war was Ravenwood's shield. Ezra Ravencroft knew this. He preached it. While the world devours itself in folly, we are chosen to build the true kingdom. And with the nation distracted, the cult grew bolder. No longer were elevations confined to midnight rituals in the cellar. Entire ceremonies spilled into the forest clearings. Villagers marched with torches, chanting in long processions that stretched for miles. Witnesses from afar reported strange fires on the horizon, sounds that carried like thunder. Yet no lawman came. No officer dared divert men from the front lines to chase what sounded like superstition. And so Ravenwood tightened its grip. Children as young as 10 were assigned roles in ceremonies, some as singers, others as bearers of offerings. Teenagers were bound together in arranged marriages, ensuring bloodlines never strayed beyond the congregation. Outsiders still vanished, but now entire families who passed through were taken whole. Their wagons burned, their names struck from memory as though they had never existed. In the dim stone catacombs, Ezra constructed new chambers. Rows of saints posed in eternal silence. Above them, children practiced hymns of blood, their voices echoing against bone and brick. To the Ravencrofts, this was legacy. To the outside world, if it had ever looked, it would have been horror beyond measure. But what is most disturbing is not the cruelty, but the devotion. By the mid-1860s, some cultists volunteered for ascension in staggering numbers. They believed their sacrifice would shield their loved ones from the war, that their blood sealed the covenant of protection. One journal, recovered decades later, bore the words of a young woman, "I do not fear the blade, I fear only being left behind. To ascend is to be remembered. To refuse is to vanish into dust." This was the inversion Ravenwood perfected, making death a prize and survival a shame. And while the nation bled on its battlefields, Ravenwood grew fat on its own blood. The war ended in 1865. Bells rang across the nation, soldiers limped home, and widows wept for husbands who would never return. America yearned for peace, for healing, for a new beginning. But in Ravenwood, there was no end to blood. There was no peace. The cult had thrived in the shadows of war, and now it was stronger than ever. Ezra Ravencroft emerged from those years not diminished but exalted. To his followers, the survival of Ravenwood through the nation's chaos was proof of divine favor. The world collapsed. He declared, "But we stood untouched. The covenant has been sealed." And so the rituals grew more elaborate. No longer confined to midnight secrecy, processions now wound through the valley even at dusk, their torches lighting the horizon. Outsiders whispered that the Ravencrofts had become kings in their valley, untouchable lords of a private kingdom. But the truth was darker. Ravenwood had become a machine that devoured its own people. Entire generations were raised knowing nothing beyond obedience and sacrifice. Births were celebrated not with lullabies, but with vows to offer the child to the covenant when the time came. Graves multiplied in the churchyard, but the number of names carved into stone never matched the number of bodies lowered into the earth. Too many simply vanished, folded into the endless hunger of the rituals. Travelers returned with stranger tales. One merchant spoke of hearing dozens of voices chanting in the forest, though he could not see a single torch. A trapper swore he saw women in white gowns, faces veiled, walking into the river at dawn and never rising again. Farmers in neighboring towns found flocks of crows gathering unnaturally, blotting out the sky before circling back toward Ravenwood. And yet, still no authority came. Reconstruction politics consumed the nation. Corruption thrived in city halls. What was one strange valley compared to the challenge of rebuilding an entire country? So Ravenwood endured. Worse, it flourished. Wealth flowed through land deals and quiet partnerships. The Ravencrofts were no longer merely preachers. They were landlords, traders, and patrons. Their influence reached courts and councils. What had begun as a hidden congregation was now a dynasty, and in its depths, beneath layers of power and prayer, the blood still flowed. By the 1870s, Ravenwood had become more than a town. It was an empire of silence, a kingdom ruled not by crown or law, but by fear and ritual. And yet, even in the tightest chains, something always strains to break free. It began with whispers. Younger members, those born after the war, questioned why the Covenant demanded endless blood. They had not seen the war years. They had not lived in terror of the outside world. To them, sacrifice no longer felt like protection. It felt like theft. A young farmer named Elias Gray was the first to speak aloud. In hushed tones to a friend, he asked, "If the Covenant protects us, why do we suffer more than those beyond the valley? Why do they live while we bleed?" Such questions were forbidden, but questions spread like sparks. Soon others murmured the same doubts, in barns at wells, in the shadows of the fields. Ezra Ravencroft heard of this dissent. His sermons grew sharper, harsher. He thundered that doubt was the work of the serpent, that rebellion was the path to damnation. And yet, behind his eyes, there was unease. For the first time in decades, obedience was not absolute. Then came the night of the broken circle. During an elevation ceremony, 7 chosen stood before the altar. But when the blade was raised, Elias Gray refused to kneel. His voice rang out, "No more. This is not salvation. It is slaughter." The crowd gasped. Some cried out in horror. Others secretly felt their hearts surge with something they had not felt in years: hope. Ezra's response was swift and merciless. Elias was seized, dragged before the congregation, and executed not in secret but in spectacle. His body was burned to ash, his name forbidden from ever being spoken again. The Ravencrofts called it a warning. But warnings are double-edged. The fire that consumed Elias's body lit something deeper in Ravenwood. Some bent lower, terrified into renewed submission, yet others carried his defiance in their hearts like smoldering coals. From that night forward, Ravenwood was no longer a perfect circle of unity. Cracks had formed, and through those cracks rebellion began to breathe. The fire that devoured Elias Gray did not extinguish his spirit. It scattered it like embers. In the years that followed, those embers found kindling in the hearts of others. Quietly, secretly, Ravenwood began to divide. On the surface, nothing had changed. The Ravencrofts still ruled with iron sermons and sharpened blades. The hymn still rose at midnight. The torches still cut through the fog. But beneath this facade of unity, hidden factions began to stir. They called themselves the Silent Brethren. Farmers, widows, young men and women who remembered Elias's defiance. They spoke in whispers by the river, carving symbols into tree trunks as secret signs. They pretended loyalty in public, kneeling at the altar, chanting the hymns, but their eyes carried a different fire. Their mission was not escape. That was impossible. The valley was sealed by fear and superstition. No one left Ravenwood without permission, and those who tried were never seen again. No, the Silent Brethren had a bolder dream: to tear down the Ravencrofts from within. But rebellion against a family that had ruled for generations was no simple act. Ezra Ravencroft's reach was everywhere. The church doors were watched, the homes were spied upon, and every family carried its own loyalists who would betray their neighbors for favor. Trust itself became a weapon, and so the Silent Brethren learned to hide behind masks of obedience. Still, their courage grew. They began small, sabotaging ritual tools, hiding relics, delaying processions. At first, the Ravencrofts dismissed these acts as carelessness or misfortune. But when offerings vanished before ceremonies, when chants faltered because key voices were missing, suspicion spread. Ezra's sermons turned paranoid. He raged against traitors in our midst, warning that betrayal would bring ruin upon all. And in the silence that followed, eyes darted across pews. Who was loyal? Who was not? The Ravencrofts tightened their grip. Punishments grew crueler, public, meant to terrify the wavering. Children were questioned, families interrogated, homes searched in the dead of night. The church bell no longer rang for worship. It rang for judgment. Yet the more the Ravencrofts crushed, the more the silent brethren adapted. The rebellion became quieter, smarter, harder to detect, and somewhere in the depths of Ravenwood, a plan was forming, a strike that could unravel the dynasty itself. By the winter of 1876, the silent brethren had waited long enough. Years of whispered meetings, of stolen relics, of secret vows beneath the frozen trees had led to one decision: the covenant must be broken, and the Ravencrofts must fall. The plan was simple in its design, reckless in its execution. During the night of elevation, the grandest ritual of the year, the brethren would strike. Hundreds of followers would gather, cloaked and chanting, while Ezra Ravencroft stood at the altar. It was the one night when the entire cult assembled in one place. When the Ravencrofts themselves were exposed, the brethren prepared weapons hidden in plain sight: sickles, axes, blades sharpened not for harvest, but for blood. They swore an oath to Elias Grey's memory, binding themselves to a single truth: better to die in defiance than live in chains. The night arrived. Torches lit the valley in a river of flame as the congregation marched to the chapel. Inside, the chanting rose, a thunder of voices shaking the rafters. Ezra raised his hands to deliver the covenant's command, and then, chaos. A torch was hurled into the altar, flames leaping high. Shouts tore through the hymns. From the crowd, the silent brethren surged forward, blades flashing. Screams filled the chapel as loyalists and rebels clashed in a frenzy of violence. Blood splattered against the pews. Sacred hymns drowned beneath the roar of battle. For the first time in Ravenwood's history, the covenant was broken not by sacrifice but by defiance. But rebellion is rarely clean, and the Ravencrofts were not unprepared. Hidden guards, fanatics loyal beyond reason, drew their weapons and struck back. Ezra himself did not flee. He waded into the chaos, his voice booming over the screams. The covenant cannot be broken. The serpent devours the traitor. His followers rallied to him with feral devotion. The chapel became an abattoir. Fire consumed the altars, smoke blackened the rafters, and bodies fell by the dozen. The silent brethren fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered, outmatched, and betrayed from within. Someone, one of their own, had warned the Ravencrofts. By dawn, the rebellion was ash. The brethren lay dead or captured, their names erased like Elias before them. Ravenwood smoldered, but the dynasty endured. And in the silence that followed, one truth became clear: rebellion was possible, but survival would demand something far darker. The aftermath of the failed uprising was more terrifying than the battle itself. Ravenwood awoke to silence, but it was the silence of a graveyard. Ash still clung to the chapel ruins, the stench of charred flesh lingering in the air. The Ravencrofts wasted no time in turning the rebellion into a lesson carved into the marrow of every survivor. Ezra decreed the purification. For 7 nights, the bell tolled at midnight, summoning the townspeople to the square. One by one, suspected rebels were dragged before the crowd: men, women, even children. Their names were stripped away, their faces branded with fire, their bodies broken upon the altar stones. Some were left hanging as warnings, others buried alive beneath the roots of the forest. The silent brethren were annihilated, their families erased, their homes burned. Even their graves were forbidden, as if memory itself was treason, yet whispers endured. Mothers rocked their children to sleep with forbidden lullabies of Elias Grey. Farmers carved tiny sigils into the soil before planting. Symbols of defiance lived on, even if only as shadows. But the Ravencrofts had won. They stood unbroken, draped in the blood of their enemies. The purification did more than crush rebellion. It cemented the dynasty as untouchable, ordained not just by fear, but by legend. To question them became unthinkable. To resist became suicidal. As the decades passed, Ravenwood grew quieter, darker. Outsiders who ventured into the valley often vanished, their stories swallowed by rumor. Travelers spoke of ghostly lights in the hills, of hymns drifting across the fog. Some claimed they saw pale figures watching from the tree line, eyes glowing in the dark. Ezra Ravencroft's descendants carried his legacy, each generation inheriting not only power, but the ritual of blood. Ravenwood was no longer just a town. It was a wound that refused to close, a scar on the land where rebellion had been crushed so utterly that even history bowed its head. And yet, the story survived. Whispers of Elias Grey, of the silent brethren, of the night the covenant was broken. Some say their spirits linger, still haunting the chapel ruins, waiting for another chance. Others believe the Ravencroft's bloodline is cursed, that their triumph was only temporary, that the serpent they served will one day devour them, as it devoured so many before. In the end, Ravenwood remains what it has always been, a place of silence, sacrifice, and secrets, a dynasty built on blood, a rebellion buried but never truly dead.